Before there were garden centers, before there were synthetic fertilizers, before there were plastic irrigation systems and pH meters and pre-mixed potting soils in bags, people grew things. They grew them successfully, abundantly, and in some cases, with a sophistication that modern gardening has quietly abandoned in favor of products that are easier to sell than knowledge is. What follows is a collection of 25 gardening practices that were once common knowledge, passed from grandmother to grandchild, from neighbor to neighbor, from the person who had been growing things for 50 years to the person who was just beginning. Most of them require nothing you do not already have. Most of them work on principles so sound that the science has only confirmed them more thoroughly with time, and most of them have been forgotten, not because they stopped working, but because nobody is selling them anymore. Secret 1. Bury banana peels directly in the soil at the base of roses and other flowering plants. The peel decomposes rapidly and releases potassium, phosphorus, and calcium directly into the root zone. Ancient gardeners did not know the chemical names for these nutrients. They knew that flowers grown where kitchen scraps were buried were larger and more vigorous than flowers grown where they were not. The mechanism was not understood. The result was Secret 2. Use wood ash from a fireplace or fire pit to raise soil pH and add potassium and calcium. Ancient gardeners maintained specific beds for wood ash application, rotating it through the garden systematically. A light dusting across the soil surface, worked in lightly with a hand tool, shifts pH incrementally and adds minerals that leach away over the season. Do not apply near acid-loving plants like blueberries, azaleas, or rhododendrons. Do apply near brassicas, asparagus, and most fruiting vegetables, which prefer a slightly alkaline environment. Secret 2.5. Save and reuse cooking water that has not been salted. Water used to boil eggs, vegetables, or pasta contains dissolved minerals leached from the food during cooking. Ancient frugal gardeners poured this water, cooled to room temperature, directly onto garden plants rather than down the drain. Egg water in particular contains calcium carbonate dissolved from the shells during boiling, which is both a soil amendment and an antifungal compound. The practice costs nothing and wastes nothing, which is precisely the philosophy that made ancient kitchen gardens productive on minimal resources. Secret 3. Plant marigolds throughout the vegetable garden, not as decoration but as pest management. The roots of marigolds release theophanes, sulfur compounds that are genuinely toxic to soil nematodes, the microscopic worms that attack root systems of tomatoes, peppers, and other nightshades. Ancient kitchen gardeners interplanted marigolds throughout the vegetable bed, not because they were told to by a horticulturalist, but because they observed, over generations, that gardens with marigolds had healthier root systems and more productive plants. The French marigold, Tagetes patula, is the most effective species for nematode suppression. Plant densely, ideally as a solid bed for one full season before planting the vegetable crop. Secret 4. Use comfrey leaves as a mulch and slow-release fertilizer. Comfrey, Symphytum officinale, has one of the deepest root systems of any common garden plant, penetrating several feet into the subsoil and mining minerals, particularly potassium and nitrogen, that are unavailable to shallower-rooted plants. When those leaves are cut and laid around other plants as mulch, those minerals become available as the leaves decompose. Ancient European gardeners called comfrey the hospital plant and grew it in a dedicated bed specifically for its leaf harvest, which they applied several times per season. Secret 5. Water in the morning, never in the evening. This practice predates any scientific understanding of fungal biology, but it reflects a sophisticated empirical observation. Plants watered in the evening go into the night with wet foliage and wet soil surfaces. Fungal spores that land on wet foliage at night, in the absence of sunlight and with temperatures dropping, have optimal conditions for establishing and spreading. Ancient gardeners who watered in the morning noticed that their plants had less disease. They attributed it to the morning light being good for plants. The actual mechanism is that evening moisture creates the specific conditions that fungal plant diseases require. Secret 6. Press garlic cloves directly into the soil around roses and fruit trees. Garlic produces allicin and other organosulfur compounds that function as natural antifungals and as deterrents to aphids and other soft-bodied insects. Ancient Persian and Chinese gardeners planted garlic among their prized ornamentals specifically for this protective function. The companion planting was not decorative. It was pharmaceutical, an understanding that certain plants produce compounds that protect neighboring plants from specific threats. Secret 7. Make fermented plant tea from nettles. Stinging nettles, Urtica dioica, are extraordinarily high in nitrogen, iron, and trace minerals. When nettle leaves are packed into a container with water and allowed to ferment for 2 to 3 weeks, they produce a liquid that is both a foliar fertilizer and a soil amendment. Ancient European gardeners used nettle tea as a spring tonic for everything in the kitchen garden, applying it diluted 10-to-1 with water directly to the soil around vegetables, herbs, and fruiting plants. It smells terrible during fermentation. It works exceptionally well after. Secret 8. Companion plant beans with corn and squash. The Three Sisters planting method, used by indigenous peoples across North America for thousands of years, is one of the most sophisticated companion planting systems ever developed. Corn provides vertical structure for bean vines to climb. Beans fix atmospheric nitrogen and add it to the soil, feeding the corn and squash. Squash leaves cover the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining moisture that benefits all three plants. The combination produces more food per square foot than any of the three planted separately, and does so while building rather than depleting soil fertility. Secret 9. Use eggshells around the base of plants to deter slugs and add calcium. Crushed eggshells create a sharp physical barrier that slugs and snails are reluctant to cross. They also decompose slowly and add calcium to the soil around brassicas, tomatoes, and other calcium-demanding crops. Ancient gardeners saved every eggshell from the kitchen specifically for this purpose, storing them dry until they had enough for a full garden application. The barrier needs to be refreshed after heavy rain, which washes the sharp edges smooth. Secret 10. Grow herbs among vegetables to confuse and deter pest insects. Basil planted near tomatoes, dill near brassicas, rosemary near carrots. The volatile aromatic compounds these herbs release into the air mask the chemical signals that pest insects use to locate their preferred host plants. An insect searching for a tomato plant by scent encounters a complex aromatic environment that confuses its navigation. Ancient kitchen gardeners maintained highly mixed planting specifically because experience taught them that monoculture blocks, single-species rows, attracted pest pressure, while mixed plantings did not. Secret 11. Steep chamomile flowers in water and use the liquid to water seedlings. Chamomile tea has documented antifungal properties, specifically against the damping off fungi that kill seedlings at soil level shortly after germination. Ancient gardeners who started seeds indoors or in frames watered them with weak chamomile tea and observed that seedling losses were dramatically lower than without it. The practice works. Modern antifungal research on chamomile extracts has confirmed the biological mechanism that ancient observation identified. Secret 12. Use dried, crushed leaves of aromatic plants as a mulch around vegetables. Mint, lavender, tansy, and wormwood all produce volatile compounds that persist in dried leaf material. When dried and crushed and used as a surface mulch around vegetables, these compounds continue releasing aromatic deterrents that make the vegetable bed a less hospitable environment for crawling insects, flying pests, and in the case of tansy and wormwood, certain mammals that find the scent offensive. Ancient cottage gardeners used every available aromatic plant material in this way, creating a layered aromatic defense around the kitchen garden. Secret 13. Mark and save seeds from your best plants, not from typical plants. This seems obvious, but it is one of the most powerful practices that commercial seed production has effectively ended for most gardeners. When you save seed from the plant that produced the most fruit, the most disease resistance, the earliest maturity, the best flavor, you are selecting for the genetic characteristics you want in the next generation. Ancient farmers did this systematically over centuries, and it is how every heritage vegetable variety was developed. The tomato variety that performs best in your specific garden, your specific soil, your specific climate, is something only you can select for. Secret 13.5. Steep nettle or comfrey leaves in water for 24 hours and use the unstrained liquid as a foliar spray. Unlike the fermented teas that require weeks, this quick steep produces a lighter liquid that is rich enough in soluble nutrients to be absorbed directly through leaf surfaces. Ancient gardeners applied this kind of plant-derived liquid to foliage in the early morning, giving the leaves time to absorb what they could before the midday sun dried the surface. The practice was used especially during periods of root stress, when the root system's ability to take up nutrients was temporarily reduced, and foliar feeding provided a direct nutritional route. Secret 14. Water deeply and infrequently, rather than shallowly and often. This practice was standard knowledge in ancient kitchen gardens, and has been repeatedly confirmed by root biology research. Shallow, frequent watering keeps moisture in the upper inch or two of soil, which is where most weed seeds germinate and where temperature fluctuations are most extreme. Deep, infrequent watering drives plant roots downward in search of moisture, developing the deep root architecture that makes plants more drought-tolerant, more nutrient-accessing, and more structurally stable. Ancient gardeners without access to running water watered deeply when they watered, because they had limited water to use, and had observed that thorough soaking produced better results than daily light applications. Secret 15. Apply diluted human urine to the garden as a nitrogen source. This practice is ancient, global, and scientifically sound. Human urine contains approximately 2% nitrogen in a water-soluble form that is immediately available to plant roots, along with phosphorus and potassium in useful quantities. Diluted 10:1 with water, it is an effective liquid nitrogen fertilizer that costs nothing. Ancient gardeners used it routinely and without embarrassment as a natural resource. Modern gardeners have largely abandoned it out of cultural discomfort with a practice that is biologically impeccable. Secret 16. Grow green manure crops and dig them in before they set seed. Clover, vetch, mustard, phacelia, and buckwheat grown as cover crops and incorporated into the soil before flowering, add organic matter, fix nitrogen in the case of legumes, break up compacted soil with their root systems, and suppress weeds through the growing season. Ancient farmers maintained a rotational system that included dedicated green manure periods for each section of the garden. The practice builds soil fertility over time without any purchased inputs, using only the fertility generated by the plants themselves. Secret 17. Plant bulbs in groups of odd numbers and at irregular spacing. This practice comes from generations of observation that naturalistic plantings, the kind that look as though they seeded themselves, are more visually compelling than geometric ones. Ancient formal gardens deliberately created the appearance of naturalistic plantings through irregular groupings and spacing that mimicked how bulbs spread in the wild. The rule of odd numbers, 3, 5, 7, creates groupings that the human eye reads as natural rather than arranged. The irregular spacing within those groups creates the randomness that makes the planting feel as though it grew rather than was placed. Secret 18. Use the no-dig method for new garden beds. Ancient gardeners who created new beds from existing turf or weedy ground frequently used a layering method now called sheet mulching or the no-dig method. Cardboard or thick layers of organic material were laid directly over the existing vegetation, which smothered the grass and weeds and began composting in place, improving the soil below while eliminating it as competition. No digging, no tilling, no back-breaking sod removal. The layers decompose and the bed becomes plantable from above as the layers break down. Secret 19. Talk to your plants. This sounds like folklore, and the science is genuinely preliminary, but there is documented research showing that sound vibrations, including the vibrations of human speech, affect plant growth rates and stress responses in measurable ways. Ancient gardeners in many cultures maintained relationships with their gardens that included speaking to plants, singing to them, spending time with them in ways that went beyond the purely mechanical. Whether the mechanism is sound vibration, carbon dioxide from breath, or something not yet understood, the practice of spending attentive time with plants, close to them, observing them at their level, produces better outcomes than inattentive maintenance from a distance. Secret 20. Bury fish scraps or fish meal beneath transplants at planting time. Indigenous North American agricultural traditions, as well as ancient European practices, buried fish material at the base of planting holes before setting transplant seedlings. Fish decompose rapidly in soil and release nitrogen, phosphorus, and trace minerals that become available to the developing root system over weeks. The Wampanoag tradition of burying a fish with each corn seedling, documented by early European settlers in Massachusetts, reflects a sophisticated understanding of organic nutrient cycling that European farmers were not yet practicing at comparable scale. Secret 21. Observe the moon calendar for planting. This practice has been dismissed by modern horticulture, and the evidence for it is genuinely mixed. But the lunar planting calendar, used by farmers globally for thousands of years, is based on a set of empirical observations about plant behavior at different phases of the moon. The gravitational pull of the moon affects moisture movement in soil in the same way it affects ocean tides. Whether this effect is significant enough to influence germination and growth rates in practical terms is debated. What is not debated is that ancient farmers who used the lunar calendar were paying close attention to timing and conditions in ways that benefited their gardens regardless of whether the moon was the actual mechanism. Secret 22. Create a hot compost pile that reaches killing temperatures. Most backyard compost piles decompose at temperatures that are too low to kill weed seeds or plant pathogens. Ancient farmers knew how to build a hot pile that generates enough microbial heat to reach 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit in the core, temperatures that kill most weed seeds, most fungal plant pathogens, and most root rot organisms in the compost material. The method requires the correct ratio of carbon-rich brown material to nitrogen-rich green material, adequate moisture, and regular turning to maintain oxygen flow through the pile. The result is finished compost in weeks rather than months, and compost that is genuinely safe to use around any plant without risk of introducing disease. Secret 23. Use companion plants to attract beneficial insects. Ancient gardeners maintained flowering plants around the perimeter of kitchen gardens, and within them specifically to attract and retain populations of beneficial insects. Dill, fennel, yarrow, Queen Anne's lace, and sweet alyssum all attract parasitic wasps, hoverflies, and lacewings that are the primary predators of aphids, whitefly, and caterpillars. A garden with a resident population of beneficial insects manages its own pest pressure largely without intervention. Ancient gardeners who maintained diverse plantings and flowering borders had fewer pest problems because they had provided habitat for the predators of those pests. Secret 24. Grow vertical. Ancient kitchen gardeners with small plots used vertical space as aggressively as horizontal space, training cucumbers, beans, peas, squash, and melons up structures made from available materials. Branches, woven willow, stacked stones, and existing trees all served as vertical growing structures. Growing vertically improves air circulation around foliage, which reduces fungal disease pressure. It puts fruit and leaves in better light positions. It dramatically increases the productive square footage of a small garden, and it creates the kind of lush, layered vertical abundance that makes a small garden feel twice its actual size. Secret 24.5. Keep a garden notebook and record what worked, what did not, what the weather was like, and what you planted where. Ancient farmers maintained oral knowledge passed between generations about which practices worked in their specific location. The garden notebook is the written version of that accumulated knowledge, and it is one of the most consistently underused tools in modern gardening. What bloomed early last April? Which variety was attacked by pests in July? Where the drainage problem is in the west bed? Which tomato variety outperformed everything else in August heat? This knowledge, recorded and consulted year after year, makes every subsequent season more successful than the one before it. No purchase required. Secret 25. Let some plants go to seed and flower fully before removing them. The instinct to deadhead spent flowers and tidy up before plants have completed their biological cycle removes resources from the garden ecosystem that those plants were providing. Fully seeded plants feed birds. Fully flowered plants provide late-season nectar for bees and butterflies. Plants that are allowed to complete their cycle develop stronger root systems in their final season than plants cut back early, and the seeds they drop become next year's plants. Ancient gardeners let things finish. They were not tidying for aesthetics. They were cycling resources back into the garden system that produced them, closing loops that modern tidiness breaks open. The garden that knows these things works differently from the garden that does not. It works with processes that are already happening, rather than against them. It uses what is available rather than purchasing what is marketed. It observes and responds, rather than scheduling and applying. These 25 practices did not survive thousands of years because they were traditional. They survived because they worked. And they still do. Drop a comment telling me which of these 25 secrets you already use and which one you are going to try first. I read every comment. Give this a thumbs up if it gave you something useful, and subscribe for plant knowledge that goes deeper than the Garden Center label every single week.